Chapter 3, Part 2. 2 days later, Keith's still got Pidge's empathetic wig-snatching rattling around in his head. Ignoring it hasn't gotten him anywhere. Punching his feelings out at the gym isn't much of an option, given the way Shiro's been watching him like a hawk. Which leaves talking. And, okay, theoretically, Keith has 3 options of who he can talk to about his feelings. Realistically, there's only one option. Shiro is obviously out. Discussing how Pidge deconstructed his poor life choices would require explaining what those poor life choices were in the first place, which cannot happen. Ever. Ramel is also out. Mostly because he doesn't want to explain his poor life choices to her either, and partially because she might go for Pidge's throat if she felt that Keith had been genuinely wronged. Hunk's in the communal dorm kitchen when Keith finds him. This time, it's not shortbread cookies on offer, but cornbread. 4 kinds of cornbread, specifically, with a 5th kind on the way as soon as Hunk finishes annotating the recipe. Why? Keith asks, vaguely mystified. Why the adjustments? Hunk doesn't look up from where he's color-coding his notes. That system was definitely cribbed from Pidge's. Because my auntie is a heathen who thinks that cornbread should be made with jalapenos. Blinking, Keith grabs another piece of the sweet southern cornbread and stuffs it in his mouth. Jalapeno cornbread sounds good, he says. Mostly because he wants to be a helpful and supportive friend. Only a little because he wants to eat jalapeno cornbread. Don't talk with your mouth full, Hunk says. You'll get crumbs in my cooking space. Without even looking up, he gestures broadly to the counter space he's claimed as his own. The area is not insubstantial. Honestly, Hunk's all but colonized the kitchen in his quest to experiment with cornbread. Keith's occupying a carefully staked out corner of the counter, but if he moves his elbows too much, he'll probably knock into one set of ingredients or another. It's sacred turf, dude. This is fair. Keith chews, with his mouth closed, until he's finished the bite in his mouth. I meant, why are you making 5 different kinds of cornbread? Chili cook-off after midterms. Oh. For a little while, it's enough to be around each other. Hunk mutters to himself and annotates recipes and starts mixing ingredients. Keith plows through 7 pieces of cornbread. They talk about the chili cook-off. Some of the tension starts to leave Keith's spine, enough that he doesn't even flinch when Hunk shoves the latest batch of cornbread into the oven and then slaps down his oven mitts. Are you here for advice about Shiro's daddy kink? Chewing keeps his mouth occupied for a few critical seconds while Keith processes this. When he swallows, his throat clicks dryly, and he suddenly wonders if he shouldn't have drank more water between pieces of cornbread. Sort of? Hunk reaches up to rub at the back of his head. Not gonna lie, kind of feel like I screwed up the last time with the teddy bear, he says. Are you sure you want my advice, man? That's actually a really good point. But, yeah. Lifting one shoulder in a half shrug, he looks down at his hands with their butter-greased fingertips before saying, You know me, I guess. You see shit that other people don't. And I need you to tell me if this was a bad idea. Okay, man. Hunk's voice is equal parts solemn and kind. I don't know anything about daddy kink. Pidge did research, but I'm staying out of it. Don't know, don't want to know. Before Keith can feel too bad about the reminder that he's essentially traumatized his entire friend group, Hunk breaks him with, But I know that Shiro loves you, And that means even if this whole daddy thing is wildly off base, you're still gonna be okay. What? A pause. Keith, buddy, which part of that are you responding to? Another pause, longer than the first, and filled with intense trepidation. Also, do I need to get a chair and a whip? Because you're kind of scaring me? Gripping the counter's edge, Keith eyes his second or third best friend in the whole world with predatory intensity. What do you mean Shiro loves me? I mean, he loves you? Hunk blinks and then gestures at the entirety of Keith with both hands. How do you not know this? When Keith just keeps staring at him, he groans. Buddy, how do you not know this? No, don't answer that. I know why. Because you're pricklier than a cactus. An armed cactus. Keith feels judged, but not in the way he expected to feel judged. It throws off his reaction time, leaves him spluttering out a half-offended, I'm not. No, Hunk says. With authority. Enough that Keith actually shuts up. Taking the victory, Hunk snatches up a red-handled paring knife. This is you. You're very guarded. The knife, which is apparently Keith, disappears behind little walls of butter. Sometimes you do what you're doing now, and you kind of peek over the walls. One side of butter is nudged aside. Hunk places a yellow measuring cup next to the newly made break in the wall. If this is all a metaphor, that probably means the measuring cup is Hunk. But the walls are still there. Forget judged. Keith feels called out. With Shiro, you're a little more open. Apparently, Shiro gets to be represented by an entire cast iron pan. Okay. You let down one wall. Sometimes, if you're drunk, two. One wall of butter is nudged aside, leaving Keith as paring knife surrounded on three sides. It's progress, man, no doubt. But Shiro can't get to you when you've got most of your walls up. As metaphors go, this is the worst. Even so, Keith did ask for this, and it feels like he ought to commit at least. Okay, he says. So, Hunk says, you need to take down all of your walls. Thankfully, the oven timer dings then. Keith gets to settle back into his corner and literally chew over Hunk's advice, along with his 8th slice of cornbread. Part of him wants to ask Hunk again what he meant by love, but he's not an idiot. He knows that Shiro loves him. Platonically. But he also just got compared to a paring knife in a terrible extended kitchen metaphor, and he doesn't think he can handle another round of that. Anyway, the counselor freshman year said he had attachment issues. It's one of those things that felt like she was stating the obvious, and Keith thinks Hunk might have been stating the same kind of obvious. Like, even if Shiro never loves him back the way Keith wants him to, Shiro does love him. By the way, Hunk says, you should definitely get rid of that bear. Amen. All things considered, Keith probably ought to feel insulted by the sticky notes. He's a student in one of the top engineering programs on the West Coast. He's not relying on C's get degrees as a motto. He's smart, okay? Even if not a lot of people want to believe it. Part of him is still grateful that Hunk marked each Tupperware with a sticky note listing whether or not the food needed to be refrigerated, an expiration date, and reheating instructions. Stacking the Tupperware feels a little like playing Jenga in reverse. Keith's focused on not making a mess and ensuring that nothing gets shoved to the back of the fridge. Enough so that he doesn't notice someone else is in the room until a throat gets cleared and he nearly brains himself on the freezer door as he straightens up. "Oh, hey," Keith says. At this point, he's not even aiming for casual. It'd be a lost cause. Looking at Shiro just makes Hunk's words echo around in his head like the worst kind of movie voiceover. "You're here." "Not for long," Shiro says. "I'm going for a run." "Okay." The response is automatic. Shiro goes for runs all the time. For some reason that Keith's never been able to fathom, Shiro likes his runs. Says it's soothing. They stare at each other for a few seconds before Shiro clears his throat again. Which is a little weird. Not one of Shiro's usual tics. "I need a water," he says. Questioning. Like, he's not sure if Keith's going to deny him a water bottle, of all things. "Okay," Keith says again. Reaching into the open fridge, he pulls out a water bottle and hands it to Shiro. Their fingers don't brush when Shiro takes the bottle. When Keith asks, "Which route are you taking?" Shiro doesn't meet his eyes. Deliberately, Keith closes the fridge door and then leans against it. "Shiro?" Briefly, Shiro's eyes flicker up to his. Don't quite lock before they skitter away. All his muscles are tense, primed for flight. Or fight. "I'll come with you," Keith says. "You don't need to." More damning than the fact that Shiro won't meet his eyes is the way that Shiro's trying and failing to keep his voice even. That failure pricks at the back of Keith's neck. If Shiro makes it out that door without him, then bad things will happen. Keith knows that down to his bones. He's wearing sweats and a t-shirt. Not ideal for running, even at the tail end of February, but beggars can't be choosers. Better than jeans, at least. Grabbing his running shoes, he starts to jam his feet into them. Keeps his body between Shiro and the front door as he does so. "I want to run," he says. "Keith, you're still hurt." The scrapes on his knuckles have faded to new skin, and the bruise at his hip still pulls in odd moments, but has faded to a sickly yellow. "Not that bad." "Keith, I'm ready. Let's go." Another time, he might feel bad for the way Shiro glares at him. Only, Shiro is still glaring to the left of him, not looking at him directly, and his body still promises danger. For himself, if no one else. Keith lifts his chin and waits it out until Shiro gives in with a grunted, "Fine." They head out. Shiro sets and keeps a brutal pace. That's fine. It's what Keith expected, and he's familiar enough with this routine by now to know to keep his mouth shut about it. Once his muscles warm up, he makes sure to match his stride to Shiro's. Keeps their feet pounding at the same rhythm on the asphalt. Being in perfect step with another runner reminds Shiro of PT, and he said once that it's grounding. Roughly an hour and 8 miles in, Shiro jerks to a stop. These runs always have sudden ends, but Keith didn't expect it quite so soon. Momentum carries him a few extra steps before he manages to slow to a stop. When he turns around, he takes quick stock. All the earlier, barely contained rage has melted out of Shiro. What's left behind is disorientation that will soon turn into dissociation, if Keith lets it. Keith's not going to let it. "Looks like you kept us at a 15-minute 2-mile, he says. "Still at Army standard." We made it about 8 miles in a little less than an hour. I'm pretty sure that's the Marmora History Museum over there, which means we've done half the campus loop. The words feel stupid in his mouth. False and forced. But he keeps them up anyway, because they're what Shiro needs to keep him grounded. I'm glad it's February. If you'd had us run that in a month or two, we'd be dying from the heat. It's important not to crowd Shiro in these moments. He knows that, even as he aches to reach out and touch. The controlled exertion of Shiro's breathing and the faint tremble in his muscles makes Keith ache. Must be close to 6. Almost dinner time. Hunk sent me home with a lot of food. I think I put it all away correctly. Honestly, Keith doesn't remember. Quite possibly, he left a Tupperware or 2 of chili on the counter. That doesn't matter. All that matters is keeping Shiro grounded. You know he put sticky notes on every single Tupperware? Shiro lets out a short noise that's trying to be a laugh and reaches for him. Keith goes, tucks himself into Shiro's chest and lets Shiro's arms close around him, just shy of too tight, one hand fisting the material of his t-shirt at the small of his back. Presses his own palms flat to the broad expanse of Shiro's shoulder blades and absorbs the trembling of overexhausted muscles, and Shiro finally comes out of fight or flight. It's okay, he says. You're okay. Lips brush against his sweat-streaked temple even as Shiro crushes him closer. Are you okay? Shiro asks, and he sounds almost afraid of the answer. Yeah, I'm okay too. What about your hip? That's a good sign. Shiro's grounded enough in the present to remember that Keith had a bruised hip, and that the injury happened recently enough to be a potential issue. Crooning low in his throat, Keith rests his cheek against Shiro's chest and takes in the steady thump of Shiro's heartbeat. My hip is okay. Honesty is important when Shiro's in residuals, so he adds, It'll be sore, but it's okay. I'm okay. You didn't push me too hard. Another one of those noises, like Shiro wants to laugh, but forgot how. Some of the desperation eases from his hands, though. Gentles him until the hand at the small of Keith's back is less crushing and more caressing. We'll walk back to the dorm, he says. Promises. Orders. It's hard to tell. Maybe all of those things. Yeah, okay, Keith says. Make sure to pull back enough for Shiro to see the eye roll. I guess I'm lucky that you're not trying to carry me home. This time, finally, Shiro manages a real laugh. The third time, Keith has to stop himself from going to check on Shiro. He decides it's time to occupy himself with something more productive than watching the door like a puppy. Listening to each muffled noise wears his nerves down. Phrase them until he feels like he's going to snap. Unlike most times when he's in danger of snapping, this kind of snapping would involve less punching and more bursting into the bathroom while Shiro's in the shower, so he can make sure that his best friend isn't mentally half a world away in a war zone. Making dinner feels like a halfway decent compromise. They both need to eat. For the next 10 minutes, he goes through the motions of pouring juice, scrambling eggs, and reheating the cornbread that Hunk sent home with him. Hey. Keith flinches and turns from where he'd been moodily watching the cornbread reheat in the microwave. Shiro's standing right on the line between the laminate and the carpet. Like, he's not sure he's allowed in. Hey, Keith says back. Mostly on automatic. It's obvious that Shiro's fresh out of the shower. Hair still damp, and his t-shirt clinging to his pecs. Every line of his body screams exhaustion. No amount of military discipline can keep the telltale slump out of his shoulders. Guilt lines the side of his mouth, and there's a furrow to his eyebrows that usually signals a growing migraine. Residuals are riding him hard. But his eyes are clear and alert and focused on Keith. Okay. They'll be okay. Slowly, Keith lets out the breath he hadn't even realized he was holding. Tension bleeds out with that exhale. It's not hard to be gentle as he points toward their small kitchen table. I made some dinner, he says. Why don't you sit down? It'll be ready in a minute. Bossy, Shiro says. But there's no heat to it. Just a little gratitude. Plating doesn't take long. Keith puts the food, juice, water, and a max dose of Motrin in front of Shiro. When Shiro looks up at him, mouth opening to either form a protest or an unnecessary apology, Keith cuts him off. You don't get to go to bed until you've taken your pills, eaten, and drank all the water. Shiro gives him a lopsided grin. It's going to be like that, huh? He asks. But he obeys, eating through half his eggs before taking the Motrin with a swig of juice. Sluggish as he is, it's clearly Shiro, and Keith feels himself calming down. Whenever he has to let Shiro out of his sight during residuals, for a shower, or class, or sometimes even sleep, there's this gnawing fear that something bad will happen without Keith there to soften the blow. No one ever seems to realize that the aftermath is usually worse than the initial flare-up. It's less dramatic. Doesn't fit as neatly into carefully constructed ideas of trauma. But Keith knows that Shiro needs more support after, not less. I'm sorry. Blinking, Keith refocuses. Shiro's finished all his food and drained the juice. The water bottle is still in his hands, uncapped and half empty. He's not meeting Keith's eyes now. Time for guilt round 2, apparently. Don't be, Keith says. When Shiro still doesn't look at him, which isn't entirely unexpected, honestly, he scoots his chair closer until their knees bump together. That does get Shiro to look up. Briefly. Keith's heart thumps too hard in his chest as he takes in the slight glassiness. Pitching forward, he doesn't wince as his forehead knocks against Shiro's collarbone. Shiro. No response. Shiro. A hand curls over the back of his neck, anchoring him in place with deceptive strength. I know, he says, but this isn't fair to you. Irony is somewhere in the way neither of them know how to ask for help, but Keith doesn't care to examine that just now. Thumping his knuckles against Shiro's chest, he goes, as many times as it takes, remember? Feels the way Shiro inhales sharply, and then lets it out slowly. Relishes the way Shiro's fingers tighten around his nape, just shy of bruising. You need to eat, Shiro says. Changes of subject are expected at this stage. Encouraged, even. Keith still blinks and pulls back to eye Shiro. What? The grin Shiro gives him is worn, but genuine. You haven't eaten your dinner, he says. Which, okay. No, Keith hasn't eaten his dinner, since he was more concerned with watching Shiro for signs of dissociation, or worse. You need to eat. Reaching across the table, Shiro pulls Keith's plate over next to his own and picks up the fork. Wrinkling his nose, Keith asks, What, are you going to hand feed me? It's clearly sarcasm, but Shiro doesn't miss a fucking beat. Yes. He stabs some scrambled egg and holds it up to Keith's mouth. Open up. You're the worst, Keith says. He's a little surprised that Shiro doesn't take the opportunity to shove the food into his mouth. Then feels bad for being surprised. Of course Shiro wouldn't risk potentially stabbing him with a fork. Still patiently holding the fork, Shiro coaxes, Think of it as a birthday present. One. That'd be a shitty present. Mulishness has set in by now. It's out of self-preservation. Allowing Shiro to hand feed him feels like it might unlock something in Keith that he's not quite ready to deal with. 2. Your birthday isn't until this weekend. 3. Please. God fucking damn it. Keith opens his mouth and allows Shiro to feed him a bite of scrambled eggs. Chewing with more viciousness than strictly needed doesn't give him enough outlet, but it's the only outlet he has. Any chance of complaining or protesting went out the door when he saw the way Shiro's entire body softened as Keith's lips closed around the fork. Later, he'll need to deal with what all of this implies or resolves. Now, he lets Shiro feed him another bite.